We've talked about how wars get started. How do you hope the war in Ukraine ends? What are the ways to end this war? What are the ways to achieve peace there? To end the I would say senseless death of young men, as always happens in war.
I'm sad to say I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think there's any real prospect of a meaningful peace agreement. I think it's almost impossible. I think the best you can hope for at this point is it's some point in the shooting stops, you have a ceasefire, and then you have a frozen conflict. And that frozen conflict will not be highly stable. And the Ukrainians in the West will do everything they can to weaken Russia's position. And the Russians will go to great lengths to not only damage that dysfunctional rump state that Ukraine becomes, but the Russians will go to great lengths to sow dissension within the alliance, and that includes in terms of transatlantic relations. So you'll have this continuing security competition between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other, even when you get a frozen peace, or you get a frozen conflict, and the potential for escalation there will be great. I think this is a disaster.
That's a very realist perspective. Let me ask you sort of the human side of it. Do you think there's some power to leaders sitting down, having a conversation, man to man, leader to leader, about this? There is just a lot of death happening. It seems that from an economic perspective, from a historic perspective, from a human perspective, both nations are losing. Is it possible for Vladimir Zelensky and Vladimir Putin to sit down and talk and to figure out a way where the security concerns are addressed and both nations can minimize the amount of suffering that's happening and create a path towards future flourishing?
I think the answer is no.
Even with the United States involved. 3 people in the room.
Well, I think if the United States is involved, the answer is definitely no. You have to get the Americans out. And then I think if you have Zelensky and Putin talking, you have a sliver of a chance there. The Americans are a real problem. Look, let's go back to what happens right after the war starts, okay? As I said before, we're talking March, early April of 2022. The war starts on February 24th, 2022. Mm-hmm. And as I said to you, the two sides were negotiating in Istanbul, and they were also negotiating through Naftali Bennett. And the Bennett track and the Turkish track were operating together. I mean, they were not at cross purposes at all. What happened? Bennett tells the story very clearly that they had made significant progress in reaching an agreement. This is Zelensky on one side and Putin on the other. Bennett is talking in person to both Putin and Zelensky. And what happens to produce failure? The answer is the United States and Britain get involved and tell Zelensky to walk. They tell Zelensky to walk. If they had come in and encouraged Zelensky to try to figure out a way with Putin to shut this one down and worked with Bennett and worked with Erdogan, mm-hmm. we might have been able to shut the war down then. But it was the United States.
Well, let me sort of push back on that. You're correct, but sort of United States paints this like picture that everybody's aligned. So maybe you can correct me, but I believe in the power of individuals, especially individual leaders. Again, whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever, goes into a room and says, in a way that's convincing, that no more NATO expansion. And actually just on a basic human level, ask the question of why are we doing all this senseless killing? And look at the interest of one, Russia, look at the interest of the other, Ukraine. Their interests are pretty simple. And say, the United States is going to stay out of this. We're not going to expand NATO. And say all that in a way that's convincing, which is NATO expansion is silly at this point. China is the big threat. We're not going to do this kind of conflict escalation with Russia. The Cold War is over. Let's normalize relations.
Well, let me just embellish your argument.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. I need it.
If we say there's a sliver of a chance that you can do this, and I do think there is a sliver of a chance, let me just embellish your point.
Thank you. I need all the help I can get.
Two things have to be done here, in my opinion. One is Ukraine has to become neutral. And it has to completely sever all security ties with the West, right? It's not like you can say we're not going to expand NATO to include Ukraine, but we're going to continue to have some loose security arrangement with Ukraine. None of that. It has to be completely severed. Ukraine has to be on its own, okay? And number two, Ukraine has to accept the fact that the Russians are going to keep the 4 oblasts that they've now annexed and Crimea, right? The Russians are not going to give them back. And what you really want to do if you're Zelensky or who's ever running Ukraine in this scenario that we're positing is you want to make sure the Russians don't take another 4 oblasts to include Kharkiv and Odessa, right? If I'm playing Putin's hand and this war goes on, I'm thinking about taking 4 more oblasts. I want to take about 43% of Ukraine and annex it to Russia, right? And I certainly want Odessa, and I certainly want Kharkiv, and I want the 2 oblasts in between as well. Right.
Literally or as leverage in negotiation for Ukraine neutrality?
I want them literally. I want to conquer them literally. But my point to you is if we can begin to talk about cutting a deal now, you may be able to head that kind of aggression off at the pass. Yeah. In other words, you may be able to limit Putin and Russia to annexing the 4 oblasts that they've now annexed plus Crimea. That's the best I think you can hope for. But the point is you have to get the Ukrainians to accept that. You have to get the Ukrainians to accept becoming a truly neutral state and conceding that the Russians keep a big chunk of territory. It's about 23% of Ukrainian territory that they've annexed. And I find it hard to imagine any Ukrainian leader agreeing to that.
Well, there could be more nuanced things like no military involvement between the United States and Ukraine, but economic involvement, sort of financial support, sort of normalizing economic relationships with Ukraine, with Russia.
I think you could probably get away with that. I think that the tricky question there that you would have to answer is what about EU expansion, right? And I think EU expansion is probably a no-no for the Russians because most people don't recognize this, but there is a military dimension built into EU expansion. Mm-hmm. It's not purely an economic alliance or relationship or institution, whatever word you want to use. There's a military dimension to that. And in the run-up to the war, actually in the run-up to the 2014 crisis when it first broke out, the Russians made it clear they saw EU expansion as a stalking horse for NATO expansion. So EU expansion is tricky. But I think your point of close economic relations between, or healthy economic relations, to use a better term, between Ukraine and the West is possible. I think the Russians have a vested interest in, if it's a neutral Ukraine, they have a vested interest in that Ukraine flourishing. But that then brings us back to the territorial issue, right?
Well, so Do you believe it's possible for individual human relations to counteract the structural forces that you talk about? So, meaning the leaders being able to pick up the phone and make agreements that are good for humanity as a whole and for their individual nations in the long term.
I think leadership matters here. I mean, one of the real problems here is that there's no trust, and on the Russian side, and that has to do with the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, which were designed to shut down the civil war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, really mattered to the Russians. And there were 4 players involved in the Minsk process, 4 main players: Russia and Ukraine, of course, and then Germany and France. And I believe the Russians took the Minsk Accords seriously. I believe Putin took them very seriously. He wanted to shut down that conflict. And Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, he was the French leader, and Poroshenko, who was the Ukrainian leader. Those were the 3 key players besides Putin. Again, Hollande from France, Merkel from Germany, and Poroshenko from Ukraine have all explicitly said they were not seriously interested in reaching an agreement in all of the discussions with Putin. They were bamboozling him. They were trying to trick him so that they would buy time to build up Ukraine's military. Putin is profoundly upset about these admissions by these 3 leaders. He believes he was fooled into thinking that Minsk could work. He believes that he negotiated in good faith and they did not. And he believes that the level of trust now between Russia and the West is virtually zero as a result of this experience over Minsk. I only bring this up because it cuts against your argument that leaders could pick up the phone and talk to each other and trust each other, at least somewhat, to work out a meaningful deal. If you're Putin at this point in time, trusting the West is not an idea that's going to be very attractive at all. In fact, you're going to distrust anything they say.
Yeah, distrust anything the West say, but there is individual humans. The way human nature works is when you're sitting across from a person, you can trust a human being while still distrusting the West. I mean, I believe in the power of that. I think with the right leaders, you can sit down and talk. Like override the general structural distrust of the West and say, you know what, I like this guy or gal, whatever. I do hope Zelensky and Putin sit down together and talk, have multiple talks.
Just remember they were doing that in March, and the Americans came in and the British came in.
Yeah.
And they scotched a potential deal.
Well, the other beautiful thing about human nature, there's forgiveness and there's trying again.
When you're the leader of a country in an anarchic system, you have to be very careful not to let your trust in a foreign leader take you too far. Because if that foreign leader betrays you or betrays your trust and stabs you in the back, you could die. And again, you want to remember that the principal responsibility of any leader, I don't care what country it is to ensure the survival of their state. And that means that, trust is only going to buy you so much. And when you've already betrayed the trust of a leader, you really are not going to be able to rely on trust very much to help you moving forward. Now, you disagree with that? I hope you're right. And if they can shut down the Ukraine-Russia war, it would be wonderful. If I'm proved dead wrong, that would be wonderful news. My prediction that this war is going to go on for a long time and and end in an ugly way is a prediction that I don't like at all. So I hope I'm wrong.